My name is Claus Mathiesen. I'm a kind of expert in Russian language, culture, military aspects, politics, history, and so on. I have studied in the army for many years ago, and I have finished Copenhagen University Slavonic department. I would say that the situation in Ukraine right now is very tense. It has been tense for a very long time, for more than a year, but the latest development, the recognition by Russia of the two self-proclaimed republics in eastern Ukraine has really created a very difficult situation, because on one hand, the Ukrainian government, of course, can't accept that recognition. Either can their Western partners, and at the same time, the military tension is built up due to the ambiguity about the territory claimed by the two republics. On the one hand, they were supposed to stay in the territory which they got after the conflict and fighting ended in 2015. On the other hand, in their constitution, they have their constitution of their own. It has been written that they have the complete territory of the two easternmost regions. Putin has declared that he principally has recognized them in the full territory, and that of course has created a risk that there might even be serious military fighting. I think we all can agree that Putin is definitely not bluffing. He is very exact in his actions. It seems as if it has been run more or less by a scenario, from step to step, from building up the military tension around the borders of Ukraine to having the Russian parliament, the State Duma, suppose or give the president the possibility to recognize the two republics in eastern Ukraine, and the two self-proclaimed leaders asking to be recognized, and finally, of course, the official recognition, which took place just a few days ago. I'm not quite sure it's a brilliant move, but it was one of the developments which was to be foreseen in this conflict as it developed. There were many fears and I don't think we can completely say goodbye to them, that there would be more severe military clashes, maybe a full-scale invasion and so on, or partly invasion of greater parts of Ukraine. So this, I would say, smaller action from the Russian side was one of these options which could be foreseen, I would say. I think that what I mentioned earlier, there is a risk, and we will see in the next weeks or even next month whether there will be severe military clashes due to the ambiguity of the scale and territories of the two republics. And I think that the military pressure will continue to support the diplomatic efforts, because this conflict consists at least of three interrelated conflicts. You could call one of them the local level, where we had this disagreement between Ukraine government and the two self-proclaimed republics, and this conflict was to be regulated, solved by the Minsk agreements. In the end it became impossible, but I don't think that the situation has been solved completely by Putin recognizing the two republics, as I already mentioned, for several reasons. Then we have a Russia-Ukraine conflict, which is also about Crimea, and mainly about Russia not wanting Ukraine to become a NATO member, EU member. We heard President Putin even saying that, in his opinion, Ukraine rather is a part of Russia than anything else. And then we have the third level, which is a more, I would say, long-term level. That is a level of conflict between Russia and the West, NATO, USA, to some degree also the European Union. And in this conflict, I would say Ukraine is more like a hostage. It's just a subject or even an object in this conflict, which has much more far-reaching consequences than just about Ukraine. I'm definitely sure that Putin feels that he's right in this view on the possibility of NATO coming closer and closer to the Russian borders. And this view on the situation is, of course, deeply rooted in a perception of NATO as an offensive, aggressive alliance. I can say for sure we didn't, although we tried, but we didn't really succeed in convincing Putin, Russians in general, about that NATO would be a very good neighbor and would maybe even add security to Russia by coming to Russia's borders. Because the problem is, as we see with Ukraine, as long as there is a neutral, non-decided territory between NATO and Russia, there is a risk that these territories, in this case Ukraine, but you could also mention Belarus in this respect, they will become territories of rivalry, where both parts definitely wouldn't refrain from trying to influence, but just the opposite, would do everything to influence the political situation in the countries which would be in this neutral part of Europe, and I really don't think it would be a more stabilized situation. I would even say that it would be a more unstable situation than what we have today. We can see that becoming members of NATO, becoming members of the EU, countries have become more stabilized than they were before that. If we really should match the Russian build-up, for example, at the borders of the Baltic states, we will have to do quite a lot more. And as a matter of fact, I think that is going to happen as a result of this conflict. In my view, in my opinion, I think we are looking into a period of enhanced deterrence. Due to the actions of Russia towards Ukraine, I don't see a NATO intervention with military boots on the ground in Ukraine. I don't think that is a perspective which is for real, but I'm quite sure that the result of this will become that we will have to decide to build up a more convincing deterrence force in the Baltic states, in Poland and other places maybe where we are bordering with Russia in the near future. I'm speaking about a 5-year or a 10-year perspective. I think that from a US perspective, Ukraine has been seen as the main territory and the main factor which would prevent Russia from becoming a superpower or even a true great power once again. And that is why it was also said from the very beginning, when Ukraine became independent in '91, that Ukraine is the new cornerstone of security in Europe. I think this was meant in the way that by keeping Ukraine in a good cooperation with NATO, maybe with a NATO member perspective, we would prevent Russia from becoming a true superpower, as I mentioned, or even a very dangerous great power. But there has seemingly Russia has decided to try to become it anyway. And I think that what we hear from Putin is in a way that Russia and Putin are looking at Ukraine more or less in the same way, as if Ukraine is a very important territory for Russia to become a greater power. It's due to territorial reasons, and it's also for economical reasons. When Soviet Union broke up, Russia, compared to Soviet Union, lost some 25% of its territory. That doesn't sound like very much, but it lost about 50% of its population. And in this respect, Ukraine, which has some 44 million inhabitants, is really a very important bit for Russia. I would say that in this respect, the opinion of the Ukrainian population has changed dramatically over the last years. I was defense attaché to Ukraine some 20 years ago, and I think at that time, in polls about NATO membership, on good days they might reach 20, 25, 30, maybe even 35%, not more than 1/3 of the population. Today they reach 2/3 of the population. And that is, as a matter of fact, an effect of the aggressive Russian policy. There are many Ukrainians who would like to have a good cooperation, good relation with Russia, but Russia's aggressive attitude, not to mention the historical view presented by Putin in his speech the other day, have, as a matter of fact, pushed many Ukrainians who were quite positive away from Russia. And I would say that today the pro-Russian orientation overall in Ukraine is not more than maybe 10, maybe 15%, but it's not equally in the different parts of the country. If you look at the western part, there's almost no pro-Russian grouping. In the central parts, where Kiev is located, you have slightly more. The pro-Russian orientations are mainly in the southern part and mostly in the eastern parts, exactly in the eastern parts where the two republics are located. I would say that it is more or less the same picture as we saw, as I described a while ago in Ukraine, because it's true that NATO has been quite divided, and it's also true that one of the politics of Russia has been to try to even make more divisions, more let's say controversy in NATO and in the country, in the member countries, as an effect, especially from 2014, but I would say even stronger now after 2022. The NATO countries are becoming much more aware of what they see as a Russian threat. And this, of course, will lead to allocating more resources to NATO, and as I mentioned also a while ago, to look seriously into the perspectives of an enhanced deterrence capacity and capability. And that will be expensive. But I think that the governments in the NATO member countries are more inclined today than they were even 1 or 2 years ago to spend more money on for defense. It is, I would say, the next wake-up call, because there have been a few already. I mean, 2008 in Georgia, it was also clear that Russia would use its military means, its military tools, to create a solution which is positive for them. I think by then we had the change of president in Russia. Dmitry Medvedev became president, and he initiated a policy of cooperation with the Western countries. He wanted to modernize Russia's technology and looked for assistance, cooperation with Western countries for these purposes. And that is the reason why I think mainly that, first of all, Georgia is quite far away, but it was maybe we decided to look at the positive possibilities at that time. Then we had 2014, the annexation of Crimea. That was the next wake-up call, and once again 2022 we have had the third wake-up call, and it's almost biblical in its dimensions. But anyway, I think that yes, now countries are aware that we must do something. We must do something. The problem is that many of the things which we do right now, sanctions and so on, also will hit ourselves. My view is, first of all, that yes, there are in the so-called catalog of sanctions more possibilities. The problem is that the more severe the sanctions, the more most of them also will hit ourselves, and we are not really very prepared to that. I think there are many things which should be understood about sanctions. Firstly, if you look at the sanctions so far, Russia has been willing to pay whatever it takes, because I think there have been negative effects on Russian economy even for because of the sanctions introduced after 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. But Russia has found ways to compensate. There's another thing that we try maybe now to make personal sanctions, but sanctions more directed at individuals. The problem with this is, as I see it, that in Russia these people who will be hit by sanctions will become heroes. To be hit by sanctions is the same as becoming a good patriot in Russia. That is the atmosphere. And maybe even the government would compensate some of them, at least to some degree. Thirdly, I would say that the Russians think we are a little bit cowardly reacting to this, because we are reluctant to introduce sanctions which will hit ourselves too hard too. And I could also mention that being wealthy for many Russians, at least in the general mentality, well, it's obvious that if you are wealthy, then you spend your money, and that's good. And when the money are spent, that's the way it is. So we have quite different views on the importance of, let's say, materialistic status. So in many ways, as I mentioned before the word coward, I would also say that according to Russian mentality, they think we are cowards because they think that using economic sanctions on instead of taking a good fight. That is very simply that's cowardness in a Russian mentality perspective. Wow. So in many ways, these sanctions, yes, that is what we will do, but I don't see them as anything that will really have effects on Russian policy. I believe much more in the deterrence, but deterrence, as I said, is a costly thing, and it will take some time. You can create deterrence out of nothing.
And what is deterrence?
Deterrence is a way to say to a possible enemy that if you hit us, we will hit you even harder. And in this way, preventing him from attacking. That is the basic idea of deterrence. And deterrence mainly are you can create it in two ways. You have nuclear deterrence, that's obvious, and you have conventional deterrence. And conventional deterrence is having so many conventional forces that any opponent would understand that it makes no sense to attack. That is the basic idea. I'm sorry to say that, and I use the word coward. I think that Putin is looking at us as sissies, that we are trying once again to make sanctions even harder, sanctions, personal sanctions, and so on. I think the only thing which he will have to respect is deterrence by conventional military force. Firstly, I would say that I'm not disappointed or critical to the fact that, of course, different member countries have different approaches. As a matter of fact, I think this is our strength, that different countries might have different priorities and so on. Putin doesn't understand that. He thinks, in his view, like Russia is rather monolithic in its way of presenting its political views. He does that normally himself. He thinks that it is a sign of weakness that we have these slightly different approaches. In my opinion, it's our strength, as I already mentioned. In the end, it has shown that even Germany, who has been most reluctant to cutting economical ties for many reasons, for good reasons even, with Russia, has taken the step to at least temporarily shut down the Nord Stream 2 project. And that will be a quite strong language towards Russia. I think Russia felt that they could get something more from Germany and France, so that they could manipulate with the member countries, so that US would say one thing, Germany a second thing, France a third thing, but in the end I think we are rather united.
Yeah.
And I don't think that the differences are signs of weakness. It could do, yes, to some degree, so it is very important right now to look for ways to compensate for the lack of Russian gas. But I think that would be a very good strategy, at least a good economic, let's call it sanction or policy towards Russia. Because it is completely crazy that on the one hand we are being threatened by Russia and its military forces, which have been improved and modernized very much during the last 14 years, and these processes of modernizing have cost enormous money. And we have partly been financing it ourselves. I mean,
through the gas deals.
Yeah. And other deals with Russia. So I think it's a logical step to take. But it will probably lead to some kind of gas crisis. I hope it will be very temporary. We will have, as we've seen with France, to find alternatives. For example, building nuclear plants, which is I think it's at least a better idea today than it was 50 years ago, because of the development of the technologies involved and so on. And we will also have to look into buying gas from other sources. We have a good Central Asian market. We have a market in the Arabic countries. We have a US possibility. We have Norway. It's not that we will end up without gas. We just have to change our habits of buying it and stop buying it from Russia. I think that should Russia invade, make a total invasion of Ukraine, which I, for different reasons, think is, at least from a military perspective, not that simple. But should it happen, or another way of changing the regime in Kiev, because that is what I think is the main goal of Russia related to Ukraine, then we would have a very severe situation in Europe. We will go back. We will go back to the situation of the Cold War, where we have to have deterrence forces opposite each other in Europe along a new Iron Curtain. We will then have an Iron Curtain along the Baltic states, borders with Russia and Belarus, along Polish borders with Belarus, and should Russia get complete control over Ukraine, along the Polish-Ukrainian borders too. And this would create a completely new attitude towards Russia. I think that we are getting, unfortunately, closer and closer to this, although we are not quite there yet. I think that so far Russia will try many other means. They will keep the military pressure on Ukraine as a threat that they might try to make a regime change. I think this option still exists. I don't think that the recognition of the two republics in the East is the last step we've seen from Russia towards Ukraine. They want more. I think it became obvious through the two draft treaties they presented in December to USA and to NATO that the ambitions of Russia are quite different. To me, of course you can look at them in the way that, well, we presented some proposals which were much more than we really wanted to get a good compromise. But if you look at the text of it, it has become, to me at least, obvious that Russia has a revanchist policy, and Russia has a revisionist policy. Revanchist in the way that they think that what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union was unfair, and they also are ready to try to change it. Yeah. Well, I think that I don't think that that US would intervene in a conflict in Ukraine militarily. They might try to put some pressure on Russia militarily in a situation when this was happening by building up forces. But in the long run, I think that we will see an enhanced presence of US military in Europe. I mean, the first steps have already been taken, like Denmark has made an agreement with the US, and Polish has a bilateral agreement. And I think that more countries will try to make bilateral arrangements with US. I hope that at a certain time, NATO will be ready to exchange these bilateral agreements with a more NATO-based approach to this. Yeah. But I think the actual approach is simply based on some doubt whether NATO really will work effectively in a situation where the Russian threat became more reality. Mm-hmm. And that is why countries are making these bilateral arrangements. Norway has done it too. I think that Putin already has got a very bad reputation, at least among the European countries and also with Joe Biden's administration in US. On the other hand, he also has his fans. I noticed that the former President Donald Trump said that he thinks that Putin handled this situation in a genius way. Well, at least I can say for sure that in Russia, his support is very big, that is obvious. But I would also add to this that as Russia has become an anti-democratic and more authoritarian state, there are no alternatives. There are no alternatives for people. They don't see alternatives to Putin in the television. There's only Putin. So that his support is strong is for many reasons. Based on the experience from, example, the Chechen wars, I would say that the Russian population is vulnerable to casualties and losses of life. And if a Russian military intervention in Ukraine should result in severe battles with damage on civilian constructions and losses of many Ukrainian and Russian lives, it would create problems. I think that he has succeeded, first of all, in Georgia in 2008, as mentioned, with making a war with almost no casualties, losses, and he did exactly the same thing when during the annexation of Crimea.
Yeah.
I mean, later the annexation of Crimea and the way it was done by Russian military has been presented as an ideal for military interventions because there were no losses and no casualties, and that is why I think that Russia is vulnerable. The population is vulnerable to casualties. The problem is, what are their possibilities of protests? Because they are very limited.
Yeah.
The Putin regime has a very close and tight hand on the Russian population.
Yeah.
I mean, no one can doubt that.
No.
If I go to the Red Square in Moscow with a sign saying Putin is something, in more than 30 seconds I'll be in jail.
Yeah.
In less than 30 seconds I've already been.
Unless it's positive.
Yeah. I think you could say for sure that the Russians generally don't want war, but they have had so many wars that war is no surprise to them. Should it come, I also think that we must understand that as it has been written in the new version of the constitution, that Russia has values of its own which are different, and for example spirituality. It's not just words. There is something to it, and that is one of the things which we have to try to understand better, to understand why, for example, Russians don't make huge protests when, for example, things are becoming more expensive in the shops in Moscow, because for many people, the normal Russian, the life has become harder during the last years, at least from 2014. There was some development after the financial crisis in 2008 in the good direction, but since 2014 it has become more and more difficult. More and more millions of Russians are living under the so-called limit of what do you call it, poorness, or at least poverty, exactly. Actually, I guess that's my feeling, at least, that I'm sure that there is a will to do this in US. The Americans have, in the same way as we have, get used to a situation where there wasn't this need of military presence in Europe. But I also think that in US, among Americans, there are many who are convinced that Russia is becoming more and more aggressive, and that the Russian aggression, aggressive politics, aggressive diplomacy and so on, aggressive military stature and so on, are affecting American interests. So at least for this reason, I think that yes,
there is a readiness.
There's a readiness, there's a willingness to do that, as it was during the Cold War. I'm very fond of the principles as a representative of a small country, that even rights of small countries should be respected. I don't consider Ukraine a small country, it's a rather big country. But anyway, I am a fan of the ideas of sovereignty and a fan of the right to make its own decisions, to make its own choices, also when it comes to security. I am against the idea of greater powers, having spheres of influence and so on. So I would not give in on the Russian demands. I would try to build up a more, let's say, a stronger deterrence, and which really will be respected by Russia. And then I'll wait and see, because I'm not sure they are right, but many are saying that things might change after Putin, because it has become obvious also from the speeches and so on during the last days, that it is as if Putin is deciding everything himself. And therefore there is a hope that when he, one way or another, is gone, change might appear. But until then, I think we have to prepare for preventing war. Not prepare for war, but prepare more for preventing war. I think I agree with those who say that 2% is just a number, and you can say that if, for example, a country is having a falling gross national product, then it is easily to have more than 2% for your military and so on.
Yeah.
So, but that shouldn't change the idea that we'll all have to deliver more, including Denmark, I think. And I also see the first reactions of the Danish government that we will prepare to do that. It will take some time, but we'll do that. But I think that our main force is that we are 30 member countries in NATO.
Yeah.
So it might look a little bit strange that a country like Denmark, well, is sending 4 airplanes or a frigate or something. That's not very much, and people might even laugh of it. But it is a contribution to a totality of military and political forces, because what many people also forget is that NATO is not only a military alliance, it's also a political alliance with its values.
Yeah.
I think that we will have to, and I also think that we are slowly getting ready to do that.
Okay.
But that is my personal view on the situation.